Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whichever part of the world you're joining us from. I'm Olivia Jensen, lead scientist at the Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk at the National University of Singapore. We were looking forward to welcoming the UR community to Singapore for this event. And at the beginning of the year, we had lots of fun coming up with ideas for design, exhibits, and activities to engage the community. The year didn't turn out that way. But those ideas aren't forgotten, they're on hold, and we look forward to welcoming the community to Singapore whenever we can. In this session, we wanted to talk about an issue that's making risk communication increasingly difficult, and that's fake news. We brought together 5 panelists to help us look into some of these issues, in particular, why we believe fake news, why we share it, and what can be done about it. Our first speaker is Professor Geeta Johar. She's the Meyer Feldberg Professor of Business at Columbia Business School. And over the last several years, Geeta's been working on a research program which looked at several different aspects of fake news. Geeta, could I ask you to begin just by telling us what motivated you to get into the study of this area of fake news?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. That's a great question. I've always been interested in deceptive and corrective information, like what deceives people, acts of omission, acts of commission, is intent important? I've always been interested in those questions and have been studying it in the context of advertising and more marketing related communications. But in the last few years, I just got interested in this notion that just our whole information media and media ecosystem itself is kind of getting soiled. And it's getting soiled in this way with the leakage of so much wrong and incorrect and inaccurate information. And I thought a lot of the principles that I apply in the study of marketing and marketing media and messages are so relevant to actually this news ecosystem and trying to understand the motivations of different players, and then how do consumers actually process this information, and how do we make sure that consumers understand to differentiate between what is true and what is false.
So you've been studying fake news in social media. Now, what's the reason for the specific focus on social media? I mean, fake news has been around as long as news has been around.
Yes, for sure. I mean, fake news is not new. I think what social media does is it actually amplifies this because people are spreading it. It makes it so easy to see information, and with a click of a button, you've shared it with your whole network, and each person is in this network is then sharing it beyond. So just the amplification, I think, is huge. And then secondly, what we found when we started looking into social media and its relevance is over the last 5 to 10 years, it's almost 6 in 10 adults will tell you that most of the news they get is from social media. So for a lot of people, that's their primary source of information. And often what that means is the source of information is not as clear as it used to be. So for these 3 reasons, I think the amplification, the fact that a lot of people are getting their information from social media, and the fact that the source of a message, the credibility of the source, is quite hidden on social media. I think these 3 things make it really important to study.
How about outside the US? So a lot of what we're hearing about fake news has been centered around that particular context. But I imagine that this is a similar phenomenon outside. Have you been able to look at that as well?
Yes, I haven't studied it myself, but I have been fascinated and read a lot about this. One of the countries I've visited a lot and I've written cases and taken students to is Myanmar. And this is because the economy just opened up in 2013. And I've been quite fascinated with trying to understand how does an economy that's so closed and has no information in a sense, what happens when it opens up? What happens to the ways in which consumers and people consume information? And what happened is very fascinating because the way that Myanmar citizens get their news is mostly through Facebook on their phones. So it turns out like telecom was one of the industries that really opened up in Myanmar. And through a lot of people got smartphones, and Facebook comes pre-installed on these smartphones. So Facebook is the internet to people, and it is their doorway to the outside world. And so in Myanmar, for example, that has had really terrible ramifications. So if you think about, ethnic cleansing, if you will, of the Rohingya population in Myanmar, a lot of that started with fomenting of hatred against Muslims in Myanmar, which is a predominantly Buddhist country. And that fomenting of hatred among citizens led them to support this kind of ethnic cleansing by the army, which led to over 600,000 Rohingya people leaving their homes in Myanmar and having to go into refugee camps in Bangladesh. So that is one of the really most serious repercussions I can think of globally. And I think Facebook has a large role to play in that, which they have acknowledged actually. But I think it has not completely stemmed the flow of misinformation in Myanmar. Another country that's close to my heart is India, where I grew up, but I also go back to India very often, and I'm on a lot of WhatsApp groups with Indian college friends and family. And on these WhatsApp groups, what you see is also pretty amazing. You see a lot of misinformation circulating, and this misinformation isn't always stories. It could be jokes, it could be images, it's all kinds of things. And this misinformation also has a lot of serious consequences. So recently this year, with the COVID pandemic, what happened in India was that to a large extent, Muslims were being blamed for this. And the governing party in India has also had a part in this narrative of blaming the Muslims, the minority group, for a lot of problems within the country. And the pandemic also was being blamed on Muslims who it was said on these social media platforms were on purpose, intentionally spreading the virus. And this kind of false information takes hold and then leads to really violent repercussions and consequences. So I think it's not just like we have different realities, but I think believing in a different false reality has really horrendous repercussions in the real world.
What is it that's motivating people to share this fake news? You hinted just a moment ago that a lot of these fake news is circulating in WhatsApp groups. Part of it is about being funny, about being entertaining, about sharing things that amused you. But what have you been able to find out from your studies about what motivates people to share?
Yeah. That's a great question. And sharing is important because, as I said, the amplification that happens on social media is because people are sharing. There are a few sites that produce a lot of the misinformation, but then because they get shared over and over and over again, the misinformation really spreads. And a second piece to this, and the reason your question is so important, is that even if platforms can flag something as being false, they can't flag every clone and every repeat sharing of a piece of information. So basically something once it's out there takes on a life of its own. So it's really important to understand why people share. So to answer your question, there's been a lot of research done on that. And I can think about it in a few different ways. And you talked about trying to be funny and so on. And that makes a lot of sense. It's you want to be someone important in your network. You want to gain influence in your network. You want to be the person who people turn to and ask, you know, so you want status. And I do find in my own research that this search for meaning, search for status, search for power is something that really drives people to share news. And in fact, we did this research in the context of the COVID, what we call infodemic, because often it's not just that there's a lot of fake information, which there is, but it's also drowning out the true information. So what happens is people then fail to discriminate between what is true and what is false, and there's just this overload of all kinds of information. So what we found is people, particularly people who feel marginalized in society, either because they are of a low socioeconomic status, or they are belong to a group that's historically discriminated against. So people who feel marginalized are those who go onto social media, social platforms to find connections, to find meaning in their lives. And one way they find meaning is by indiscriminately sharing information. And what we find is if we make them feel a sense of control, a sense of power, then they become actually less likely to share information. So that's about motivations. We also know there's inattention. So people are just sharing because they think, hey, this is interesting, I'm going to pass it along. So they're not really thinking about accuracy. They're thinking about either building up the sense of belonging and affiliation with other people or trying to get meaning. They're not thinking accuracy. So that's the last thing on their minds, and they just share indiscriminately. And then another piece of work that I'm really actually very fond of is research we have done on Twitter, where we were able to scrape about 3,600 tweets from different groups of people. And we looked at people who had shared fake news, at people who had not shared fake news, at people who were sharing fact checks rather than the fake news itself, and then people who were sharing very left-wing news or very right-wing news. And we tried to compare, like, what are these different groups of people like? So most research has looked at the messages themselves, but what we tried to do is use the messages to infer the personality and the emotions that are driving people. And what we found was really fascinating, because we find these fake news sharers are in fact very much like the fact check sharers. So both, you think that these two groups are very different, but actually it makes sense. They are both motivated by the same emotions. They're both very angry and very anxious. And these same motivations are driving these two different groups of people to share information. So we wanted to dig even deeper and see, can we come up with a model that can help predict who is likely to share fake news? And therefore, if you can predict that, you can actually, if you're Facebook or Twitter, intervene in real time and check that everything a person who's going to be bucketed as a fake news sharer is sharing is actually true. So you can intervene and monitor posts. The problem is there are so many posts on Facebook and Twitter, you can't be monitoring all of them. And so what we are hopeful is, if our model can help to predict who is likely to share fake news, can you use that information to actually intervene? And so we do find that emotions and personality and what we call existential threats actually define a fake news sharer.
Geeta, the regulatory context is changing quite rapidly at the moment, and we're seeing the platforms intervene more directly, for example, in demoting particular posts that they think are fake news, or in a flagging or debunking, so linking a fake news story with a true news story. Do you think that those regulatory interventions are going to be enough, or is more still needed on the side of the consumer?
I wish that were true, that we have the supply side taking care of everything and we don't need to worry about the consumers or about the people who are actually reading all the news. And, you know, let's talk about the platforms. I think the platforms have different motivations, and obviously superseding everything is the profit motive. And what brings profit to these social platforms? It's intense emotion and intense engagement on the part of their users. And the same thing that is we are trying to fight: fake news, sensational news, conspiracy theories. These are the very things that kind of add to the pocketbook of Facebook, because these are the things that people are engaging with, sharing, and ultimately that increases ad revenues for Facebook. So I think there is a clear conflict of interest here. On the one hand, you have the good of society. On the other hand, you have profits of these networks. And I think that is a problem if we as a society expect that in this context, platforms are just going to simply do the right thing. So I don't think the demotions and the labeling and all of that, despite good intentions, can ever work, because the motives are not, the incentives, the motives, they're not aligned. And also, I don't think the platforms have the ability, even if they employ armies of fact checkers, to really fact check everything that comes on their plate. They can't do it. There's too much information coming at them too quickly. And then we know these fact checking manuals are pretty basic, and they can't really add nuance to how human fact checkers or algorithms or machines are going to do the fact checking. So I don't think the social platforms have the motivation or the ability to actually stem this. The only ability they have is to outright tell platforms or the few websites that originate the fake news, ban them from the platforms. And that's not happening. That would be the way to do this. Or I think you mentioned demoting fake news. Yes, I think that would be another way to do this, but then you've got to really have good algorithms to tell you who's posting the fake news, and all of those viewers are going to be, all of those news originators are going to be demoted. And that's, that's not happening. We've seen with COVID in the last 1 year, there's so much misinformation. Hundreds of millions of people are seeing misinformation about vaccines, misinformation about cures. So that is just multiplying at a rate that, if the social platforms were serious, this would not really happen. So I don't think you can rely on them. So I think you're going to need the intervention of regulators, of policy, if we talk about the supply side. But I do think that demand side, the side of the consumer, is very important, because it's not today, it's not Facebook or Twitter or just any one of these platforms. You need to build up a populace, a citizenry that's actually well armed for the future, and that understands how to tell fact from fiction and understands the importance of fact checking and source credibility. So we need to really educate on that side. And I think some of these interventions, like making people take notice of the source, making them feel accountable when they consume information, hopefully these can be habits that we can inculcate in the populace, among citizens, to actually raise their guard every time they're consuming information. So I think that's the hope. Ideally, you'd have an education, literacy, all of those things. But even the small interventions that I've talked about, I think that they can help people create good habits.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us, Ethan, and for sharing some of the latest research. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Sarah Cumbers, Director of Evidence and Insight at the Lloyd's Register Foundation. Sarah, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So LRF has recently published the findings of a massive global survey, I think 150,000 people in 142 countries. And in the survey, you asked people about their risk perceptions relating to going online and being online. Could you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Yes, that's right, Olivia. So the Lloyd's Register Foundation World Risk Poll asked, as you say, a huge number of people across the globe about their perceptions about risk and safety across a number of issues. And we had one particular module that looked at perceptions of risk to do with the internet. And so we asked people about three major hazards online. We asked about online bullying, about receiving false information or fake news, as it's commonly known, and about fraud as well. And we got some really interesting results. We found that 57% of people worldwide worry about fake news online, which I think shows just how prevalent the worries are that people have about that issue.
So it's really curious in a way, because if people, I mean, that suggests that people are really aware of this issue, and it also suggests that they're sort of sensitive to it. So they'll be looking at it, and you might think then that people would be less susceptible to it. I mean, how do you go about interpreting those results? What do you think they mean?
Well, in fact, when I talk about this issue, I actually commonly quote the 42% of people who weren't worried about fake news, because I think that actually this is the more interesting statistic, because it's great that 57% of people are worried, and then you hope that they will have that awareness and be modifying their behaviour online. But actually for 42% of the world's population who are using the internet not to realise that there's a risk there in terms of the information that they see online not being correct, and the impact that can have on their lives, I think is quite telling. And what I'd really like to see happen with this information is actually to empower people who are in that position at the moment of not understanding, the risk to their safety through education and training, so that they are equipped with skills. And I think we can particularly start with the younger population, so that they have those skills then going through their lives, to be able to really question the validity of information that they see online.
So I know in the World Risk Poll you also asked people about their perceptions of climate change risk, and I'm wondering whether there are any links there between the things you found about geographical spread of responses to that and any of the issues we've just been talking about relating to sort of information sources or fake news.
I mean, it's hard to say. We asked a single question on climate change. We asked whether people felt that climate change was going to be a threat to people in their country over the next 20 years, and to grade that threat. And overwhelmingly, the indication was that actually people across the world do think that climate change is a threat. We had, I think, around 60 or 70% of people saying that it was either a very serious threat or a somewhat serious threat, which actually, when you think that climate change has only been an issue that's been communicated in the last 15 to 20 years, actually to have that level of people indicating that they feel it's a serious threat is quite a success. The challenge then, obviously, with climate change is what do you do about that? And empowering people to actually take action? How can they actually do something to reduce the threat? But we certainly saw some polarization in terms of the responses to that question across the globe, and in particular, some of the countries that are that top the world in terms of their production of climate change emissions, so the USA, China and India, we found that actually majorities of people in those countries either felt that climate change wasn't a threat. So, for example, within India, 19% of people said that climate change wasn't a threat or didn't know. And then within China, 29% of people didn't know. Within America, 21% of people said that climate change wasn't a threat. And so you do start to wonder then, because those figures are much higher than they are in other parts of the world, whether there's a link between the communication about the risk from climate change and the fact that obviously the policies and practice within those countries are damaging to the climate.
And all of this data is publicly available?
Yes, it is, yes. So it's available on the Foundation's website. You can download it from there, because we felt that this wasn't a data set that should be kept behind closed doors. It's very much a gift from the Foundation to the research community, policy-making community, and we just encourage people to have a look at it and to use it to make change in the world and help keep people safe.
Fantastic. Well, Sarah, thank you very much for joining us. Now I'd like to welcome David Fogarty. He's the climate change editor for the Straits Times in Singapore, but he's been working for the newspapers and the newswires for over 30 years. David, we're very glad to have you with us.
It's great to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Some years back, disinformation around climate change, around the science of climate change, was a really big issue. And there was this idea that there was a climate change denial machine which was operating. Do you think that's still an issue today?
To a lesser extent, yes. The denial machine was very much funded by a lot of the big fossil fuel companies, particularly in the US, so the Koch brothers, ExxonMobil, and some of the other big oil and gas majors, even, and some of the coal companies. A lot of them, as we know, knew and understood internally about the threat from climate change, but we sort of realized that this would be a bad thing for their business. So the best thing was to do, as with the cigarette industry, is to go out there and try to sort of undermine the growing or emerging science on climate change. So the really sort of heyday of the denial machine is it's past, but there are still companies that are out there lobbying governments, and of course the Trump administration is especially open to being, I would say, manipulated by lobbyists, by people who want to deny the science. But outright denial has obviously been, it still goes on. But I think a lot of the public are much more aware now. So, of course, the narrative has now shifted to minimizing the perceived impacts or dangers. The other strategy, of course, is to try to sort of undermine the science, to say it's not settled. And the other thing too is that acting on climate change is too costly, and that it will damage jobs. There's no time for a transition. So all of these things, of course, anybody who's sort of looked at the climate change issue for long enough, and who's open to sort of looking at the science properly, realizes that none of these things are true.
How about disinformation or misinformation relating to natural disasters? I mean, just in the course of the last year, we've seen the wildfires in California as well as in Australia. Many other incidents of hurricanes and major storms and things. Do you see patterns of disinformation or misinformation surrounding those? Do you think that has an impact?
So the best example I've got direct experience of is the wildfires in Australia late last year and early this year. There was a lot of concern about the scale of the fires. A lot of the leading bushfire experts, climate scientists were all saying, look, this is way beyond anything that could be wholly natural. The climate change was definitely playing a part, that it was exacerbating the conditions, the extreme temperatures, the long drought, that had dried out the forests. But there are other people, including some politicians, who were determined not to believe that. And so they said, oh no, the fires must all be started by, or most of them have been started by arsonists. But very quickly it became clear that, even from the police, who said, well, we have very little evidence of that. Yes, there were a few fires started by arsonists, but the vast majority were started by dry lightning or embers from nearby fires. And that was a consistent pattern of evidence all the way through the fires. So that led, a particularly dangerous situation then of people thinking, well, this was just a one-off. This was just a nature-based thing. This wasn't caused by man-made climate change.
I'd like to come back to one of the first points that you made about disinformation or misinformation relating to mitigation, about what's possible and what's not, and what the cost of some of those actions would be. Are there some particular areas in which you feel that misinformation or disinformation has become really kind of strongly lodged into the media narratives, and where you think that it really needs to be addressed more?
Well, mitigation takes many different sort of forms. Renewable energy is one, switching to greener transport is another. Obviously, getting rid of coal-fired power stations with renewable energy on a vast scale is part of that solution. But yes, there are all sorts of negative narratives around those, again, for people who have vested interests in not wanting to take action. So again, with renewable energy, you've had people, even governments in this region in ASEAN, who have been quite reluctant to really roll out ambitious policies on renewable energy by saying it's intermittent, it's costly, and they come up with all sorts of excuses. We have to redesign the grid. Let's just stick with the incumbent energy sources, which, surprise, surprise, in the case of some countries in the region, will be coal, because they have lots of it and they can mine it and they can export it. And certain people can make lots of money out of that. So you have negative narratives around that, even though, of course, we know that narrative is long gone, that renewable energy at scale is now far cheaper than fossil fuel. And of course, even if you don't really believe in climate change, if you're of that sort of mindset, who wants to live next to a coal-fired power station, right? So just even on the air pollution point of view, renewable energy just sort of makes more sense, and it's much kinder to the local environment and to the people. The key thing is for the media to try to sort of look at what these narratives are, see if there's any truth to them, try to see both sides of the story. But if it's complete nonsense, then just say so.
That's great. So my next question was really about that, about what's the role of the mainstream, especially the traditional media, in sort of reporting on climate change. And it seems that the way that many mainstream news outlets have been reporting on climate change has changed a lot over the last 5 years or so, to have dedicated coverage, continuous coverage. Many seem to have an editorial now, which is much closer to that of the one we might associate with activists, of a climate change emergency. Do you see it positively, or is there a downside to that shift?
A story is a story is a story. So a lot of the global media organizations, from the New York Times to the Guardian in particular, of course, which has really pushed the climate emergency editorial line, see that this is a story. It's not just a cynical effort to get subscription revenue. They see this as a growing and emerging issue. Enough world leaders have said, particularly the UN, saying that this is the issue of our time, the biggest issue, that we need to act on it. So, and it's, to me now, it's because it's such a key issue, you need to have more expertise. So that's why the New York Times, Bloomberg, and others have all hired dedicated climate change teams. I think just locally, increasingly, people who are interested in climate change and sustainability, because businesses are really interested in that issue too. And we've seen that very clearly in Singapore, where green jobs, companies that need to look at their climate change risks. So in terms of the risks of climate change impacts on their business, in terms of lenders demanding companies basically make better assessments of their risks, their emissions. So they're being forced to change. So it's now become a bigger business story as well. So step by step, basically, in a decade, it's gone from being a story that's on the horizon to basically now this is the story. And I can only see it becoming bigger and bigger over the next coming decade.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, David, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Now I'd like to welcome Wu Ziyun. She's a sustainability communicator. She has an Instagram account, The Weird and Wild, which has developed quite a following in Singapore and internationally. And one of the things that Ziyun does is to condense quite complex, complicated issues relating to environment, climate, sustainability into compelling visuals, which she's able to post and reach a wide audience with. Ziyun, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So tell us a bit about your motivations for being an active communicator about sustainability issues on social media.
Yeah, so mainly I think the social media platform that I've chosen is Instagram because of its shareability, and it's a visual consolidation of, environmental issues that I cared about. And yeah, I noticed that a lot of my friends were on Instagram a lot more than Facebook and Twitter, and I thought that would be the best platform to be sharing about these things, because these things are also things that they probably are not reading on a day-to-day on the news. So I thought, why not permeate their social media with that? And I think compared to traditional media, social media does play a very important role in plugging a lot of gaps in terms of correcting misinformation or even reframing certain narratives that we particularly do not agree with, or the interactive, I guess it creates an interactive space for me to also answer questions or accept requests. So I've had people say, oh, this happened with like cruises to nowhere. Could you tell me more about it? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Or you posted something about heavy rains and floods. Can you explain to me, what happens when certain things happen, or how do monsoons, when do monsoons take place, for example? So I think engaging on social media just allows me to be answering questions in real time and to be very reactive with a lot of environmental news.
It's great. So what sorts of communications or posts that you've put up do you feel have the most impact?
I think there are two types. So the first would be the ones that do very well are the content that's very specific to Singapore's environmental news. And I suspect that is because there's just very little alternative Singapore environmental news out there beyond what you see on mainstream media. And yeah, so things that gained traction recently is the one on the NTU study on plastics, where there was a lot of uproar over how mainstream media reported it, like why plastics were better or more eco-friendly than paper.
So and that's NTU Nanyang Technological University in Singapore?
Yes, so there's, NTU, correct. Yeah, so I think that did very well because I managed to speak to a chemical engineer who then broke down everything for me and I made it into graphics. And the other stuff was on the flights to nowhere by one of our airlines, and also the things on heavy rain because it's been raining like crazy the past few days. So those do well because it's very timely and contextual. And the next one that do really well are generic environmental news that explain certain phenomena or concepts that are tough to answer, such as when oil prices drop below $0. Not everyone really has that time to look for that information.
That sounds great. And is fake news something that you've come up against? We've been talking about that a bit in the rest of this panel session. Is it something you worry about? Is it something that has ever come back to you?
Yeah, I think fake news is something that I worry mainly because, at least on Instagram, the way that you're consuming media is very quick, and you're seeing so much content that you don't really have the time to be discerning over who's saying these things, where are they getting their sources from. So you do get very susceptible to certain fake news, especially when it's as easy as clicking share and then not realizing what kind of impact that news will have. So I think I have received some of this, especially when friends are saying that, this thing that you posted about environmental news has been disproven, or there's another post that's doing this. But the good thing about Instagram is that it's so timely. So if I were to post something and they would say, okay, have you seen this other thing? Could you maybe share this instead? And yeah, then it will allow me to correct, like, okay, sorry, that post was wrong and I want to provide a correction and you should be reading these things instead. I think that's the beauty of Instagram, and we can counter a lot of fake news, especially when the hive mind is activated to provide some sort of check and balance.
And do you ever find yourself getting accused of spreading fake news then?
Yeah, I think sometimes people do accuse me of, having certain leanings or, having a certain bias. But I think no news is necessarily objective. We all have our biases. We all have, our certain inclinations. So I really do hope that people try to, it's much like the newspaper, right? You read certain newspapers to get certain perspectives. And I hope that when people follow me, my lens is from an environmental lens, and that I always back up my posts with stats, with papers that are credible, and with news articles to show them that this is where I'm getting my things from. If you want an alternative perspective, you should be seeking out another news site or another creator that can give you that, so that you yourself can make that kind of decision without me telling you what to believe in or what you should be feeling.
I think that's one of the big issues, though, is that people aren't sure often where the news is coming from. And because it gets shared by friends or family, by people you feel close to and you trust in your social network, then people tend to just accept it at face value without looking for those sources. And so even if you're providing them in your blogs, it's possible in your posts, maybe other people are not going to the same effort to make sure that their sources are declared. Amongst your network, your followers and the people you follow, do you feel like there's a kind of vigilance that people apply, or do you feel that's kind of low and maybe needs to be sort of enhanced or encouraged?
Yeah, I think for social media, because shareability is so high, we are not as vigilant, or especially when you know a friend whom you trust with whatever views or things like that, share a certain thing, you don't really think twice about, okay, how long ago is this news and how credible is this? Yeah, so it's almost as though there's that check that, okay, this person is trustworthy, so I can share that thing. But it's not always the case. So I guess a recent anecdote is that there was a heavy rain yesterday, and I reposted this post about a cat that was drowning in a flooded canal, and someone was trying to rescue it. And when I posted it, a friend said, this video is from 6 years ago. Why are you reposting this now? And I didn't even realize that it was from 6 years ago, because it was from a credible news site. And that really shocked me because I didn't take time to check. And even when you do take time to check, it's a very small part of the entire post, and you're so overwhelmed, you don't really do your due diligence in that sense. And I think the great thing is that one social platform that does this, counters this really well, is Twitter, where if you repost a news article, there's a pop-up that will say, have you read this? This is from how long ago? And are you sure you want to be sharing this? And I think that sort of provides like a small speed bump to pause you in your tracks and think about what you're exactly sharing. And not every social media platform has that. So on Instagram, you don't have that. And because sharing is so easy, there's just no time to check. And I really would appreciate it if, sometimes I try to do it when on my post to say, this is from 2 years ago, it's still relevant today, check this out, so that you give people that time to contextualize without compromising on the credibility of your content.
So, we often think of fake news and youth together. And I guess that's because young people to be some of the most active social media users. But for you, is there a particular vulnerability amongst young people? Or do you feel that this is a problem for everybody?
Yeah, I think young people, I'm guessing that this conclusion comes from the fact that young people just consume a lot more content than people before. So of course, we are slightly more susceptible in that we just don't have that kind of time to be discerning with what we read. But I think the problem isn't really with the demographic that's reading the content, but it's really the medium, because I have older friends or even family members who are as susceptible to fake news, but on mediums like WhatsApp or on their Facebook as well. And just it really is where you are getting your kind of information and how accurate they are, rather than the kind of people receiving the information. If anything, I do feel that perhaps with this realization that you're consuming so much content, youths could be even more savvy in figuring out how do we check that certain things are correct. There's even a website that can allow you to, check how credible is this, what kind of political leanings they are. And I think maybe knowing that we're growing up in this age, we could be more vigilant if we really try to, but saying that, we just don't have that kind of brain space all the time.
And June, do you feel that you're also able to use your Instagram account, your social media presence, to reach out to people who are not already interested in climate and sustainability issues?
I think it's tough because there is a certain algorithm that Instagram has that feeds you the same kind of information over and over again. So it's difficult because you almost feel like everyone sort of cares in your bubble when there's a whole bigger bubble that doesn't really care about what you're posting. So I guess there are some tactics that we try to use to overcome this, which is to post other people's content from a completely unrelated field to generate that kind of interest, or to make use of virality and get different sorts of people to be sharing certain things so that it reaches a whole other audience that probably has no contact with your content. So I noticed that it does very well when I do Singapore related content, because it's so relevant that people will share it hoping that, hey, I learned this, I've never seen this. And you tap on social networks to get out of your bubble. Or sometimes you collaborate with other people, who are in a completely different field to just get your content out. So I do see that, yeah, there are strategies, but the algorithm on social media doesn't make it easy for you.
Jian, thank you very much. It's been really interesting to hear about all that you're doing in this space. So thank you very much for joining us. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Catherine Wong. Catherine's a sociologist, and she's based at the National University of Singapore. Her work looks at elite and public perceptions of risk, in particular relating to energy and to climate change. And some of her recent work has been focusing on interventions that can be used to close the gap in risk perceptions. Catherine, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Catherine, could you give us some idea about what some of the societal level factors are that affect people's susceptibility to fake news?
Yeah, so there's been quite a number of different research that look at the various dimensions of people's susceptibility to fake news at the societal level. And I would kind of organize them into kind of 4 broad categories. So the first one would be to do with consumption practices, specifically people's consumption practice, levels of consumption of social media, for example. So some of the work that's been done in this area have found that people who are heavy consumers of social media, or people who are also heavy consumers of media in general, tend to be more susceptible to disinformation online, especially. So then the second category has to do more with like political alignment. And of course, a lot of the work in this area has focused on the US. But what I want to highlight is the stuff that's been done in Asia. And actually, this area of research is still very much developing. There hasn't been much research on the societal factors that influence susceptibility to fake news in Asia, but the ones that do really highlight the importance of trust in institutions and governments, and also political instability. So the few research that have been done in this area found that societies that have very high levels of trust in institutions, in government agencies, and in the state in general, tend to be less susceptible to fake news and false information online. And also fake news online had relatively little influence or impact on people's trust in the government and state institutions to fulfill their duty of care to society. So that's that's in terms of the role of political alignment and trust in Asia. The third category has to do more with the social context. And within social context, there are 2 subcategories that I've seen. One has to do with segregated social networks. So what the research in this area found is that people who tend to have more segregated social networks also are more likely to believe disinformation that are ideologically aligned with some of their pre-existing beliefs. Whereas those who had more diverse social networks were less susceptible to fake news in this sense. The second subcategory of social context has to do with the collective opinion. And the research in this area found that this is particularly important when it comes to issues that have a lot of high levels of uncertainty. And when it comes to an issue, fake news that has to do with issues that have a lot of uncertainty, people tend to follow the opinion of the collective. And some of the interesting experiments that have been done in this area found that people even switched their opinions and their personal preferences when they saw that the larger collective, there was more people subscribing to a particular opinion that is being presented by a fake news article. And they found that they even were willing to switch their belief or change their belief about this topic when it looked like more people were agreeing with this opinion online. And they did these experiments by changing the number of likes on a fake news article, for example. So that's the kind of third category of societal factors that influence people's susceptibility to fake news. And the fourth and the most challenging factor, societal factor, has to do with pre-existing beliefs. So some of the research that I've found in this area have found that people are more susceptible to fake news when those articles are aligned with their pre-existing beliefs on the particular topic. And it's really difficult to change people's beliefs because it requires a large-scale societal shift on the particular issue, right? So that's why I see this as one of the most challenging factors, societal factors that make people susceptible to fake news. But some of the interesting findings in the research in this area found that the experiments or the interventions that have been designed to debunk fake news and see if that works in helping to change people's misconception have found that these interventions were quite effective when people's belief on a particular topic were not very entrenched yet. So if their beliefs were a little bit, they're sitting on the fence about the issue, then the interventions were quite effective in changing their misconceptions and also and also making them more resistant to fake news.
So going a little further on the kinds of interventions that might work, I mean, one of the interventions that's come up is this idea of inoculation. And I know that that's also where your work is tending. So could you tell us a little bit more about what that involves and what direction you're taking it?
Yeah, so I've been working on the possibility of using experiments to see if it is possible to inoculate the public against fake news. And the starting point of this idea of inoculation is that it is impossible to prevent people from being exposed to fake news. But what we can do is to help them, to give them the mental tools to be resistant against the persuasiveness of disinformation and fake news. So very much like a vaccine, where you introduce a weakened version of the virus into the body to kind of trigger the system to develop antibodies against the virus so that it's better able to cope with the real virus. The idea of inoculation in social theory is that you introduce a weakened version of fake news to your participants and then help them to, as a way to kind of trigger mental antibodies against the techniques of fake news, right? So the experiment that we're trying to develop in this project that I'm working on has kind of two key components. So the first one is that you first give a warning to our treatment group that they're about to encounter an article about fake news. And then the second component has to do with giving them the reputational preemption. So tools for them to refute the various aspects of disinformation that is going to be presented in the fake news article they're going to read. Now, the difference in our approach, which it's not new, it has been done, but we're modifying it a little bit to the Asian context. So the difference here is that we're using active refutational preemption. And this means that, instead of just giving them an article, a fake news article, and saying, and then giving them the facts to say, this is why that is wrong or false, we're getting our participants to step into the shoes of the people who are creating fake news. And in the literature, they have kind of identified 4 archetypes of fake news producers, the conspiracy theories, the denialists, the alarmists, and the clickbait mongers. And each of these different characters write fake news articles in subtly different ways. So the idea is that by getting our participants to step into the shoes of these people and to create a news article in line with these characters, that they would be even more, they would develop even stronger mental antibodies against the techniques being used by fake news producers. So yeah.
Really interesting. And do you think that this is something that could be applied in policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's 2 main kind of like key policy implications. So the first one has to do with digital literacy among the youth. And so, obviously there's very clear educational implications of our study and this inoculation approach. And also a lot of the research in this area has focused on youth, and there's a lot of, because youth are heavy users of social media. But what I think has been also neglected, which is the second policy implication, has to do with the digital literacy of the elderly. And because the elderly, especially in Singapore, they're also like quite, digitally savvy, and a lot of them are plugged into the internet and to social media as well. And I think this is a group that has been quite neglected. So I think there's certainly policy implications for the elderly to maybe get the elderly healthcare, elderly care homes, or to community centers to develop events or programs to get elderly people in Singapore to play this game so that they too can be inoculated against fake news.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Catherine, for sharing those ideas and those recommendations.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'd like to wrap up with a few points that stood out for me from the discussion. All our panelists were agreed that platform-level solutions are not going to be enough to combat the scourge of fake news. As we heard from David, the content of fake news is changing all the time. And the speed with which fake news is produced and spread means it's probably impossible to prevent disinformation from getting in front of people. But the positive part, as we heard from Geeta and Catherine's research, is that there are user-level interventions that do work to help people to develop vigilance and these mental antibodies. So the question now is how these can be scaled up. And as Sarah pointed out, more than 40% of people around the world aren't worried about fake news, even though they're almost certainly coming into contact with it. So how can we reach this wide audience, from youth right up to the elderly? A third point was the need to act fast. Interventions work best when people haven't yet made up their minds. This means that risk communicators then face the difficult task of getting facts in front of people as quickly as the fake news gets produced. And finally, we heard that fake news is often shared by individuals who feel marginalized, and it gets entrenched in socially isolated groups. Chi Yun talked about her strategies to reach outside the bubble by deliberately engaging with different groups and finding ways to link the issues that we care about to those that are important to others. And that's something that we can all begin to do straight away, both personally and professionally. We're running out of time. And something we weren't able to do today is to allow for any direct interaction between the audience and the speakers. That's a pity, because the Q&A is often the liveliest part of a panel discussion. But I'd like to thank you for staying and listening to the end of this session. Big thanks to our speakers, and big thanks to my colleagues at IPUR who've helped to put together this session. So to everybody, stay safe, stay well, and see you in Singapore before too long.
I hope very much that you enjoyed that informative panel discussion about some of the biggest challenges of our time. We're just about at the end of the opening ceremony program, but before you go on to the rest of the forum, I would like to invite you to join the plenaries on Day 2 and Day 3. Day 2's plenary will be all about risk and crisis communication in a time of COVID-19. We will hear from government officials on how they communicated with the public all through the pandemic and are continuing to do so today. Day 3's plenary is on another topic that is incredibly important: racism and exclusion. The exclusion of people in society based on any number of characteristics, including the social construction of race, increases vulnerability and ultimately the risk of certain individuals and groups. It is crucial to open up conversations about how racism and exclusion shape risk. The World Bank has been developing innovative ways to engage in learning and dialogue on anti-racism. One of the ways is through thought-provoking cartoons. They can help us see beyond our comfort zone and notice the clash between what is and what could be. Here is just one example of a cartoon, co-created with professional humorists during a World Bank retreat on anti-racism. If you want to help shape the plenary on Day 3, please join the community sessions titled Racism, Exclusion, and Risk in your agenda. These interactive sessions will co-create content that will then be on display in the plenary, including a spoken word performance and a set of original cartoons. At UR, we are committed to seeing more inclusion around risk assessments, communication, and decision-making that takes all of the challenges confronting the most vulnerable into account. Additionally, should you need a bit of calm, in the on-demand library, you will find a session on mindfulness in times of disruption and uncertainty with Mingyur Rinpoche. Or if you need some lively entertainment, remember that the Toa Mata Band is also in the on-demand library. There is an amazing variety of community sessions for you to pick from. We invite you to personalize your agenda on the platform to attend the ones of interest. Please note that there may be caps on sessions, so do get there early to ensure your place. And just a reminder that most sessions will be recorded and available after the forum should you miss anything. Each one of you have helped to create a more resilient world and this amazing community. I know that the next 10 years will see great advances in partnerships, leading to our ability to better understand, reduce, prepare for, and respond to disasters and climate change. With your tireless commitment and passion, you are an inspiration to us all as you strive to make the world a better place. I hope you have a wonderful few days at UR 2020, and I look forward to seeing you at the closing ceremony on Day 3. Until then, keep learning, keep being inspired, and keep thinking the unthinkable.